What's going on in Myanmar? Hundreds of thousands of locals are crowding the streets. The nation's leader, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, has been arrested for walkie-talkies. On Monday the 1st of Feb, while filming her morning routine, this instructor accidentally captured the beginnings of a military coup. The military announced a one-year state of emergency, and the power would be handed over to this country.
Before we get into today's show, I just want to add a quick reminder that any donations given to our nonprofit, Better Burma, will be shared directly with those in Myanmar who need it most. Any and all donations will make such a difference right now. Go to insightmyanmar.org/donation if you would like to contribute, or stay tuned to the end of the episode and hear more options. With that, let's get into the show. On this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, I'm really pleased to be joined by Miles Vining, who has long connections to Myanmar and has some research from his life there to share that I think will be very interesting and very unique. Miles, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate coming on board, and this is really, really an honor to be among all the other guests on this show.
It's an honor to have you here. It's an honor to welcome you to our humble platform. Before we get into some of the research that you did and the implications of that research, can you just set the scene for us and tell us when you got to Yangon, what your early experiences were there, and just kind of describe how you found your way to Yangon and what life was like for you at that time?
Yeah, my parents moved to Yangon in 2003. I was about 13 years old, 13 or 12, and I was transitioning from 5th grade to 6th grade, growing up in Thailand. And my parents had two different jobs there, so we lived there for about 5 years, 2003 to 2008. And I went to ISY, International School Yangon in Golden Valley, from 5th grade to 10th grade, middle school, from 6th grade to 10th grade, middle school to high school. And I was a pretty obnoxious, rambunctious, troublemaking kid who sort of had a very tough time fitting in, didn't make very many friends, pissed off a lot of people and teachers, and kind of figured out my own way among things, just like any other teenager in their prime time, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So what was the experience like of just being a kid in Yangon? And I guess that's a two-part question. One part, what was it like while you were being a kid and being in Yangon as an environment to grow up in? And the other part is the flip side of that, the city of Yangon and Burmese culture. What was that experience like for a kid to be in?
I think it was kind of like a roller coaster in a lot of ways, because you had a lot of leeway and freedom, but you actually had very little opportunity at the same time. I mean, you had a lot as a teenager in Yangon. I went clubbing, I smoked cigarettes, I drank hard liquor, I went to crazy parties. Like, I would go to the US and people would be talking about, oh, you can't go to these clubs because they're not over 21. I'm like, what are you talking about? I just went to entire raves as a 15, 16-year-old. So you had a lot of freedom because there's a lack of law in a lot of ways. But there's very little opportunity in terms of, there was no, what I was used to growing up in Thailand, right? There weren't that many sports teams at ISY. You had like the soccer team and the basketball team, neither of which I was on except for 1 year. There was no Boy Scout or Cub Scout troops that I was in, Troop 731 in Chiang Mai. Library, that was non-existent. You had the American Center, and then you had the ISY library, which was like okay, but it's like you could quickly read all the books there. You were generally you were kind of confined to Yangon. I mean, technically you had to apply for like various passes to like go to like Kachin and stuff like that. But no, you could get out to like Bagan, to Pie, to Jaitio, to Sagaing, not to Sagaing, but like to the beaches and stuff like that. So yeah, you could get out. And then the dictatorship was there. It's like you saw it everywhere you went. It was a part of living. It's like, and for as a teenager, it was on the more practical side of things. It's like, oh, well, you can't go by Suchi's house because the road's blocked off. Oh, well, we can't go down that street over there because they have a roadblock down there. Oh, look, this general's coming through again. We gotta like change all the traffic lights. But then the upside of that was like going down to the local guard post on the intersection of like Inyala and like giving the dudes like a 6-pack every month. And so every time we drive by, like they would flick the lights, the stop lights to green. Right. So that was like kind of funny doing that. And for me, I was just a teenager going through like a really rough time as a kid against the backdrop of this like very crazy geopolitical like military dictatorship going on. And it was kind of like, oh man, this is nuts. Military dictatorship. All right. Like, what am I going to wear for prom? It's like that. That's the kind of things like your priorities are like, they're neck and neck, like following the daily life of society. And then like, oh man, how are my buddies going to see me every day? So it was interesting in that sense, I guess.
What's interesting hearing you talk is I realized that, and I'm sure you're aware of this, so often when Westerners, Americans are trying to bring their experience of Myanmar, understand Myanmar to the world, and this is not just true today, it's not just true of the last decades, but really centuries going back to the British colonial period and earlier European travelers, there's this exotified nature, that this Orientalist spin of how they try to describe Myanmar. And there's people who've been there, Westerners who've been there longer, try to get more authentic and try to break through the usual kind of exotified lens, but it's still often there to some extent. But you were just talking about it in the most mundane of ways, and indeed you were there from when you were 6th grade. So I wonder, like at that age, was just this kind of normal life for you? Because often, whatever circumstances we're in when we're kids, however weird they are, that's normal. We don't know anything else. And so do you this kind of normal, exotified way that Myanmar is often portrayed, do you feel like your early years of just by nature of being a kid and going through adolescence and teenage years there, that was something that you never really interacted with, and that your perspective and experience kind of breaks through the normal exotified lens that it's often brought to the West?
Yeah, because I would go back to the U.S. in summers, and the U.S. was exotic to me. I was like, wow, everyone's got the same time on their watches, and people actually obey laws here, and I can't just buy cigarettes or alcohol wherever I want. Like, that was exotic. Like, I was like, you people are weird. Like, like, let me go back to where I feel kind of normal. Sort of a typical, like, third culture kid kind of thing. For sure.
Right. And so you mentioned you went to ISY, that's International School of Yangon. It's the elite private school there. Who did you go to school with? Who were your classmates? Who were your friends? What was that experience like?
It was a really eccentric mix of international folks. I mean, you had all my classmates were generally, Burmese, Korean, Malaysian, like some Americans, a handful of Europeans, very few like Africans or South Americans. I don't think there's any South American kid at the entire school. Very few Africans, and everybody was like the children of diplomats, of oil people, or not oil people, but like business people, NGOs, all sorts of different walks of life. There's a kid in my class who was, his dad was like a teak dealer, which was like totally illegal. Then you had like Dan Shui's grandson who was in like the 2 years below us. And then you had a guy who's like his Burmese, but his dad worked for like the UN in Darfur or something. And then you had a bunch of all the Koreans were business. They were all business folks. There was a couple exceptions of the embassies, but most of the Koreans were businessmen, business families. And then the European kids were mostly NGOs. So you had different NGOs that were in Yangon at the time, whether it was UN or some of the others. There were a couple missionaries, but not that many. The Tegenfelds was the big missionary group there. They were a grade actually above me, David Tegenfeld and Caitlin Tegenfeld. And then you had some, like pretty rich Burmese families that had businesses and stuff like that. So, but everybody, everybody at the school ground, everybody was sort of equal, right? No, there was no like pulling a rank or like, oh, well, my dad's a bigger businessman than you, or my dad's this. Like no one really cared, and it didn't really make a difference. It was kind of like, oh yeah, his daddy like sells illegal teak, and his daddy is like a big shot businessman. I don't care. I'm going to score against him either way in soccer at recess. But it was a backdrop if you noticed it, but most of the time as children, like we never noticed it. We just like it didn't matter who your family was. You went to the same house parties. You're on the same soccer football team, same soccer or basketball team. That was just the backdrop of everything that was going on around you.
Right. And you mentioned in your years that were there, you coincided with the Saffron Revolution and Cyclone Nargis. So what was it like to be on the ground for those experiences, especially at that young teenage age?
Yeah. So Saffron in 2007, that happened first. And that was, because you were everyone was sort of shielded from the political reality of everything. And when that happened, it's like, you could no longer face it or ignore it.
Right.
So that was, to me, since my family was so much more involved in Burmese politics and everything, it's like I was like sort of in tune to the drumbeat at all times. Whereas a lot of the Burmese kids, they had a kind of like denial where they would just deny that anything was going wrong outside, and they would just kind of live normally, and they did not want to be affected of it. I think it was kind of like a survival instinct among a lot of the Burmese in Yangon, where it's like, yeah, you're living under a military dictatorship. Life sucks. The economy's trash. But what are you going to do about it? Like, just keep on trucking, right? If you try to do it, like, there's no use doing anything against it. You just get shot down in the street. And with the international kids, a lot of them were like totally oblivious. Like, especially like sort of the business kids and stuff like that. They're like, military dictatorship? Like, what does that even mean? Primarily, I think because like their families are interested in business. It's like if you're anything deviating from the profits and the bottom line is like that's just not important, right? So that's what they were living with. So like Saffron rolls around and like school gets shut down. The American embassy is like everybody has radios at the embassy, and everyone's like on call for that. And it's not until probably a couple days after, and everybody sort of makes themselves scarce, and pretty much everyone just goes into lockdown and just stayed at their house, or they would like refuge at like other people's houses, for example. And you had kids who'd like stay over at their friends' houses or, for that kind of thing. But as long as you stayed home during the revolution, like nothing really would happen to you. And especially for a lot of the kids at that school, I mean, they're pretty privileged as it was. And they all lived in their golden towers. There's still an apartment complex there, right, called Golden Tower 1 and 2,
right?
And like kids, like a fair percentage of the school actually lived in those towers, and it's like, well, you just lock yourself up in there and you're good to go. So I don't know. It like I wanted to go out, and I was following, and my family was following very intently for everything, and we were making like tentative plans, like to be like, okay, well, if things get really out of control, like, okay, my dad was like, hey, have a bag packed, like, get ready. If we have to leave the house now, like, we're going to abandon this, and this, and just bounce. So like, that was in the backdrop of everything. And then everything kind of petered out and settled down, and it's kind of like, is it really over? Is it really over? And then it's like, okay, school's starting again. It's like, well, yeah, it really is over if we're going back to school. That was nuts. And then Nargis happened, and I think the semester was even curtailed a little bit. Nargis happened. It was kind of like, I remember, I think like it was a weekend that Nargis happened, or a third or something. And it was like the storm came and it was nuts. And it was like, trees blown down, utter devastation on the streets. It did, it didn't really affect many of the buildings in Yangon. It really affected a lot, like a lot of the trees went down, and not many buildings were actually damaged. Like, maybe some fences here and there, but it was mostly like foliage. But then it was, I think I remember it being like Sunday evening, we were like, okay, are we going back to school or not? And then word slowly trickled around by phone and was like, hey, maybe come to school like midday, it'll be a half day kind of thing. And then like later that evening, it's like, no, you're not going back to school until like Tuesday. And then it's like Tuesday rolls around or something, and it's like, no, all of ISY is out for a whole week. So, and then we basically had the week off, and there was like, I think there was like some assignments of homework here and there, or like some odd things. And then you would be like, we went into school to just receive homework and then come back, kind of thing. And that was kind of that. And then Yangon sort of cleaned itself up afterwards. But that was my last year in Yangon. So two kind of big traumatic events to finish off our years there.
Yeah, right. So that's a great backdrop for just understanding who you were at the time and what you were doing there. Let's get into some of the meat of the real work and substance that you started on in a rather surprising way, and where that information went and the implications of it. Why don't you start us off with, I believe the story starts with you giving cigarettes to embassy guards. Correct me if there's another beginning, but that's the one I heard, and start us off there.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, as like a teenager, not really fitting in, not really having many friends, and then at the same time being fascinated kind of from my interest in video games, from playing Medal of Honor and Call of Duty and Counter-Strike, that led to an extreme interest in small arms. Mm-hmm. And because I didn't have many friends, I had to very quickly figure out something to do in my time off. And I quickly began this obsession with going into guard posts and becoming friends with guards, because every diplomatic mission had a police guard post assigned to it. Every large NGO, like the UN, right? The UN, all the UN spots had guards assigned to it. A lot of the traffic circles and a lot of the intersections had policemen assigned to them as well. And they would be in their little guard shacks. And these dudes would just like sit in their shacks all day. They would fill out their report logbooks, and then maybe the sergeant and the guard would come by like once a day or once a week. Mm-hmm. And they had these old rifles, like M16s, M1 carbines, like from the Vietnam era and the Second World War. And they barely, like a lot of them did not have ammunition for them. They were kind of just like an honesty check, like, all right, don't do anything in front of me or else I'll have to report you, or I'll have to mm-hmm. like butt stroke you or something. Mm-hmm. And I was young, like 14, 15, 16. And I was, interested in going into the service. I'd hang out with the Marine Guard a lot. So to me, wanting to be around sort of young guys in the service was like what I really wanted to identify with, because I knew I was going in that direction. Mm-hmm. So I kind of identified with a lot of these younger guys, like not much older than me. Some of them very much older than me. And so I would just began this adventure series of trying to look at all their guns. And so it would become a game, and I would be like, okay, if I can get the serial number of a rifle, that's a win. If I can like look at the entire rifle, that's a win. If I can, have the rifle in my hand, that's a win. If I can take it apart, that's a win. If I can disassemble it and take pictures of it, then if I can make a video with it, that's a win. That's like the ultimate win right there. And I started doing that, and I wasn't successful like many times, but many times I was successful. And that's when I started recording like all this information about these. I was like, I want to start writing down all this stuff. Like, I can't just be like messing around. And I think it was a big like revelation to me one day when I was like, wait, I've been looking through all these guns and I haven't been writing down anything about them. Oh man, I've gone through like 20, 30 guard shacks already and I haven't written anything. That's terrible. Mm-hmm. Like that like those serial numbers are now lost to history. So I started writing them down and cataloging them and writing about the condition of the firearms. And, that's when things like, kind of like a diligent researcher would, like, okay, let's get down into the statistical details of stuff and look into things. And I would come up with all these weird tricks, like bringing cigarettes to them or hanging out with them. And I had a story, and I had like cheat cards written down in Burmese that said like, can I see your rifle? And they would be like, who is this like 15-year-old freaking like Galawa over here? Like, yeah, I see my rifle. Like, I don't know what you're going to do with that, like, you weirdo. But a lot of these guys, like just lonely young dudes on posts. Sometimes they'd be with their families. Sometimes they'd be with other buddies or friends. And they'd just be like, okay, this is entertaining. Here. Yeah, look at my M16. What is it going to do? Right. So that's what I did. And there's some amusing things out of it. I mean, there were certain times where or I remember one particular time when I was like looking at one near on University Avenue, and then I heard over the radio the commander was like, "Hey, who's that over there by your post?" And the guy was like, "Oh, it's this Gulliwa." And the commander's like, "No, don't let him look at your gun. He's already been here before." And I'm like, "Ah, darn it, they got me!" Like, oh, and then I'd make it a competition on like Saturdays because I had a bicycle, and I used to ride all over Yangon. Like I would go, like my longest rides would be from like the intersection of Inyala and University down to Shwedagon, or down to the embassy, or down to over to Dubern Park. I would just get around. And so I would be like, okay, and I would like sort of recon my route, and I'd be like, okay, well, I know I can do a route where I can pick like, there's like 5 or 6 guard posts on it, and I'd like pick those guard posts, and I'd try to like, okay, how many can I get today? I think my biggest rate was like 4 or 5 guard posts in one day. And then I had to come up with like tricks to remember the serial numbers, like, because with a guard that wouldn't let me, like I would have to like, memorize the serial number and then walk away and then quickly write it down out of sight, right? So it was just this big game to me, and I really enjoyed it. It was kind of like the thrill of holding a real M16 or holding a real M1 carbine or a real this or a real that, and I enjoyed it a lot. And I didn't have very many friends, and I didn't, play too many sports back then. So this is my ability to get out and have fun, and I dug it. And I was able to see things like when guards rotated in and out. And I mean, it's like if I were some sort of intelligence asset, like I could tell you things about a lot of these guard posts, like new battalions that moved in and took over. I could tell because like, okay, it's a different rifle this time. And I'd start seeing the same rifles in other locations. So I could be like, okay, well, that rifle has appeared in 2 other spots in the city, because they've moved around, or that squad is this. So, I mean, all this stuff, right? But that led to my interest in sort of Burmese small arms, and sort of figuring out like everything became a puzzle to be solved, right? And it's like I'd learn about the guns, and I'd be like, well, how did they get here? And what do these serial numbers mean? And how do I deduce more information from this? And what's the bigger picture, and what's the bigger story that I can put together? And that's where I, jumped into more research about, well, how did a Browning high power end up here? Or how did an SKS end up here that apparently everybody is saying is made in Yugoslavia, but really it's made in China? And what are these all M16? So it became like a mystery to me. And I was like, wow, this is great. I really want to dig down, because I was reading about all these guns in like gun magazines and gun books and stuff. And I was reading their histories and everything. But I was like, man, there's nothing out there on Burmese stuff. And I was like trying to research Burmese stuff, but there was nothing out there on it, because nobody had written about Burmese guns apart from like Andrew Self, and then a couple choice, articles in Irrawaddy, and a little bit here and there. But it's like nothing really substantial. And I was like, darn, like I really got to dig into this, man. Like if I don't, no one else kind of will. But more just because like, wow, like I need to research this stuff. So I just began, and that's how it started. And it really culminated. I mean, and then I started getting more and more professional with my gun writing, and I ran into the editor of Small Arms Review at the Knob Creek Machine Gun Shoot in 2008, early 2009. And I ran into him, and he's like, oh, I was like 16 years old, and I was with my uncle, and I was like, oh man, that's Dan Shea over there. I want to go meet him. And then my uncle was like, yeah, let's go meet him. And my uncle was like, oh, is Mr. Shea around? And his wife was like, oh yeah, Dan's over there. And I'm like, Dan, Mr. Shea, I'm like really, really amazed to meet you. And like, you're the only gun magazine I read. Like Small Arms Review is the best, because it had like history, it had descriptions, it had like new stuff, old stuff, everything. Whereas like even at that young age of 16, I could be like, yeah, guns and ammo. It's like, that's all a fad. It's like all that stuff is paid advertising anyways. But Shay, I was like, damn. And then he did the craziest thing, and he asked me like, oh, so what's your story? Like what are you going to expect asking any 16-year-old? Like, what are you really going to expect back from them? Any 16-year-old in the world? It's like, what do you have to offer, man? It's like, I was like, well, I've been in Burma, and I've been researching. Like I've been doing a lot of research. I've been not even doing. I was like, well, I'm in Burma, and I've been looking at a lot of Burmese guns for the past 5 years. And he goes, "Huh? How about you write me an article about that?" And I'm like, "What?" Like jaw dropped to the floor. Like what the heck?
Mm-hmm.
So I get with my uncle, and he's like, "Okay, this is how you should do it. Structure it this way." I write this thing, it goes through all these revisions. I actually give it to like 2 different English teachers I had in high school at the time. Like, I don't even know if I'm right. Like, I was so excited about this thing that I wrote it all up and like did the formatting myself and gave it in a PDF form. Like, I spent more time than I did writing the article because I had all the information already that I wanted to write, you know. But I did all the formatting. So I put all the captions in and I put the pictures in setting and all this stuff. And I was so proud of that. And I emailed it to Dan. And I was like, Dan, like, Mr. Shea, like, here's what I have so far. And he goes, "Look, we do the formatting, kid. You just send us the text, the pictures, and the captions, and we got the rest." And I'm like, oh, I'm like so embarrassed. I'm like, oh no, he's going to reject me because I like did the wrong thing. This is terrible. But eventually got published under the pseudonym of V. Kenneth, called Burmese Small Arms Development. And I wrote several more after that for Small Arms Review. And that's the beginning of my small arms career in terms of writing and researching.
Yeah, that's incredible. Just going back to the actual moments of, all the tricks you played in terms of riding your bike to hit different posts and learning Burmese expressions that you can tell them to get to see the weapon, taking pictures and trying to get more and more information from those weapons. Did you have any close calls with that? I mean, this is a totalitarian dictatorship. This is not a safe or free society. People have, many people who've done far less have gotten far worse. So did you have any close calls in all those experiences, or did you ever have any fear of any close calls or repercussions that would impact you or your family?
Not really. And I mean, like, to be dead honest, it was kind of my white privilege was really working
Sure.
for me in all this.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, if you want to call a spade, it's like, if I had been an Asian kid, if I had been even a brown American kid, it's like, no way would I have been
Yeah.
able to get away with this. Like,
Mhm.
I probably would have gotten kicked, probably would have gotten cussed out at. But because I was this like random white kid showing up on a bike and saying, "Hey man, you want some cigarettes? Can I see your M16?" Like, it must have been like, if you land, I don't know, if you drove up to like a medieval castle
Mhm.
in a smart car and said,
Yeah.
"Do you mind if I get some coffee?" Like, that's the equivalence, I guess. So that, no, I didn't ever once really feel any repercussions. I was never really like when guys didn't want to show me their stuff, they would be very upfront about it, and they would just be like, "No, Dwame, get out, like, no, leave, like, I don't want to
Yeah.
talk to you," kind of thing. And I'd be like, "Okay, I'll go," you know. And I sort of had, but the thing is, I sort of built that into my plan as well, because I wouldn't ever like I built up a dialogue, and the climax of the dialogue would be, "Can I see your rifle?" Right? And if they
Right.
said no, I would be in a position where because I would be asking them about their day. I'd be like, "Oh, how are you doing? How's it going?" It's like, "Oh, it's a hot day." Like, "Oh, is this the Israeli embassy?" Like, "Oh, is the ambassador here?" Like, "Oh, wow, how long have you been on here?" And then I'd be like, "Oh, can I see your rifle?" And they'd be like, "No, of course not." And I'd be like, "Oh, no worries, man. Oh, hey, here's a cigarette. Do you have a lighter? Okay, boom, boom. All right, hey, man, I'll just be on my way and I'll leave." So I
Right.
would build that into the dialogue. So I would not be like just rolling up on a bicycle and be like, "Hey,
Yeah.
let me
Yeah.
see your rifle." It's like, no way. Like, although I did get away with that a couple times. But you had to strategize it, and you had to like pitch it perfectly, and you had to like go in for the kill, and you had to read the situation. I had to be aware. Okay, was this like, the posts that I got away with it the most were like outposts, like in the middle of nowhere, like down some back alley, and it's like the Yugoslavian embassy was a favorite of mine because it was like down this alley right next to my house, easy kill. And I had a fantasy on like my last couple days in Yangon of like stealing their SKS and then like leave the country with it. But I was like, man, if I steal their SKS, like, because I thought I could get away with it because I knew where they kept it. I knew that they slept at night, and I knew they just hung it up inside there because I'd been to that post at night. But I was like, man, if I stole their SKS, that guy would like go to jail. Like he would be so screwed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
he wouldn't deserve that at all. He was just
Yeah.
some like 20-year-old know nothing, just doing his thing. It's like that guy doesn't need to go to jail. Like the freaking major who's like killing people in Karen State, that guy needs to go to jail. It's
Yeah.
like, so I didn't like, but yeah, I had to like strategize it perfectly. There's very little room for error kind of thing because you had to like make the perfect elevator pitch in that sense.
Yeah, gosh, I wonder if you're giving any CIA agents listening in an idea of utilizing 16-year-old white kids in some far corner of the world for different missions, because it just, the way you describe it, it's so random and unexpected and out of the blue that somehow defenses are already down in terms of how you're able to talk and navigate and have these conversations. And basically, what's so interesting is you started out in your own description, you're bored, you don't have friends, you're looking for things to do, you have this one passion that is starting to animate you, and there's this gap of knowledge in the world about this thing. And so it becomes kind of this mystery as a 16-year-old kid you're looking to do. But then in the process, maybe even unbeknownst to you, as this is happening organically, suddenly you're like, you're intelligence gathering. Like you're learning things you're not supposed to know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I could tell you like which posts had ammunition and which didn't, like which guns were working and which weren't, like what guys were cool and what weren't, like that kind of thing. But I wasn't realizing it. I was just doing it because it was a challenge. And you know what? It kind of, interestingly, like it kind of started as a challenge too, because I remember there's this other kid at the American embassy who told me very early on in my time in Burma. He said, like, one time I remember he said, hey, those guys don't have any ammunition, right? Like one of the Marines asked the guard hut and said, oh, do you have any, like, let me see your ammo. And he's like, oh, I don't have any ammo. And it was because of that, I was like, but how does he really know? Has he actually seen it? So there's always like a bit of like, no, I got to find this out for myself. Does he really not have ammo? Because that was like one of my original like quests. It's like, do these guys really not have any ammunition? Like that's a crazy thing to have. Like, how do you have a soldier, like how do you have a policeman on duty with a rifle and no ammo? And it's like, what? And the answer I found out was some of them did, some of them didn't. It depended. And it depended on that kind of thing. So always take a good challenge for what it's worth, right?
Right. And I'm also wondering, because you were there during the Saffron Revolution, I know that you were pretty sheltered, but did any of your knowledge of firearms and kind of which different units were having access to which weaponry, did you have any access or insight into what forces were being deployed during the Saffron Revolution and the implications of that?
Not really, because the forces that were used in Saffron they bust in like these mega police units that weren't there before, and they reinforced everything. But it gave some insight into what they had, because the Burmese brought out some stuff that no one had seen before, and the police had stuff, and the army had stuff that was like, what is this? Like, we got to see that. Well, for example, this Burmese 40 millimeter grenade launcher called the BA-40, I believe. But it's a single shot breech loaded side swinging grenade launcher that was very interesting. It was one of their first uses of actually polymer buttstocks and polymer furniture that people had seen, and it happened around the same time that the MA series of rifles got an upgrade with polymer furniture as well. This particular brown polymer furniture that they're known for in their later variants, that had not been seen before. They also brought out a bunch of old stuff that people didn't realize they had as well. Bren guns, for example. And I got some of the fringes of that. So a little after the Saffron, it's like as the guard posts were like, because they left a bunch of cops like on duty around the city. And so I was able to like get some of those cops as well. And they brought out a bunch of old stuff that people hadn't seen them with in a long time. Lee Enfields, Bren guns, Webley revolvers, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was more revealing. There's very little I could tell doing it. Things were just moving too fast and too heavy for anything to make a difference in that time period.
Right. So let's get to some of your analysis that you ended up having. I mean, again, this would have to emphasize this started out as something you were doing. You were bored. It was a game. It was a challenge, but then you start to develop this real catalog of including photos and videos and where which weaponry is belonging to which post, actual serial numbers, tracing where the gun is from, and start to get curious about how these different weaponry got in. I'm just going to start with a very open-ended general question and maybe go into more detail based on what your answer is. But what did you find generally? What were the implications of what you were finding, what these weapons were, where they were from, and anything else you found as you started to build this catalog?
The overall sort of summary of Burmese small arms development is that the Burmese need to rely on external countries for their small arms development, and they favor an ability to manufacture everything in-house from soup to nut, as it's sometimes called. So on almost every derivative and variant of Burmese small arm that has been in use by the Burmese, it has been entirely manufactured locally by local industry. At first, things get imported, wholesome from those parent countries, so to speak. But eventually, the entire line is produced right there, and that's a big effort for a country to do. And of course, in the dictatorship where you spend all your money on the military, that's not as hard to do, but it's a significant challenge. And the Burmese rely on these sort of technical countries, so to speak. So, for instance, before 1988, the country was West Germany through the companies of Heckler & Koch and Fritz Werner. Fritz Werner did all the import-export into Burma and set up the technical know-how and set up the factories that produced the Heckler & Koch designs, such as the G3 and slight variants of the HK-33, which were, the G3 was known as the BA-62, the BA-72, and then there was another variant that was very similar that people attribute to the HK-33, but it's actually not an HK-33 at all. So that's a big deal with that, in that you have all this tech that's being brought in and then produced locally, right? After 88, that switched to Israel. And, it's a sticking point. Prior to 88, there's one of the only Israeli exports to Burma was like a couple Spitfires in the 50s or in the 50s or 60s or something. And there's very little relationship between Israel and Burma until after 88, where West Germany breaks off relations, and then Israel comes to the forefront and says, "Hey, we're willing to be your arms partner." And this is a very conniving part on the way of Israel that no one ever talks about, because both countries saw each other kind of like, I guess, where in the movies where you have like two characters that are just lost, but then they kind of lock eyes with each other, and then they're for each other for life kind of thing. So both Israel and Burma need each other at the UN whenever they need, like, hey, Israel, give me a vote on this, and I'll give you a vote on that. Israel more so than Burma, because there's very little of the UN that affects Burma, right? But there's a lot of the UN that affects Israel, and in also other cases as well. But so that's an example where Israel swoops in and completely revamps Burmese small arms production, and all the infantry arms, all the small arms in use by the Burmese infantry, Burmese military at the squad level. The light machine guns, the underbarrel grenade launchers, the main battle rifles, and the carbines are all of Israeli design and manufacture. They're of Israeli design, not of Israeli manufacture. In the beginning, you have some Uzis that get imported, but that's about it. And that's where we kind of are today. Not as strong with Israel as Israel weans off, like slightly, but ever not so slightly, because there's still a lot of connection to Israel. Like even, in the past couple of years, Israel's selling like patrol boats and stuff like that. And the Israeli-Burmese connection is still very strong. The Israeli embassy in Yangon is one of the most indigenously heavily guarded facilities in Yangon. You've got MI on it. You've got multiple guard posts on it. You've got all sorts of stuff on it. Whereas like the American embassy is definitely most heavily protected embassy in Yangon, but that's only because the U.S. makes it so, right?
Mhm.
The Israeli embassy in Yangon is heavily protected because of the Burmese presence around it. You've got several posts, like you've got at least 3 posts that are like sort of front, middle, and rear at the entrance to the Israeli embassy. Then you've got Burmese posts that are actually and overwatch positions above the embassy, and sometimes you have Burmese guards and Burmese policemen on top of the embassy, and you have MI officers, plainclothes officers, like roving around the embassy as well, and that doesn't exist at any of the other embassies to that extent. You didn't even have that at the U.S. embassy. You had like 1 or 2 guard posts, and that was it. And maybe 1 behind the American embassy and 1 in front of it, but the Israeli embassy more so. So you have this theme of the Burmese working with a country to produce their small arms locally and indigenously. The interesting thing as well, though, when it comes to small arms production, like a lot of people, a lot of like arms experts or defense experts, they have a lot of theories, and people always like to have conspiracy theories about small arms in terms of saying, oh, well, maybe they're going for the bullpup, or maybe they're going to switch over from 7.62 to 5.56. But the reality of the matter is that small arms are such a minor factor in the generals' minds in like geopolitical stuff and in battle. I mean, it's really only the American military that takes small arms so seriously to such an extent where we have an active effort to replace the M16 and M4 probably every decade since the Vietnam War, like that we pour millions of dollars into, and that has never replaced the M16. Other countries don't even come close to that in their small arms programmings, right? So my point is, small arms are not very important, like geopolitically or even, via military strategy. I mean, most countries in the world, it has to take their small arms, like utterly failing miserably all the time, catastrophic malfunctions. Like we lost that battle because our battle rifles weren't good enough. It takes that kind of a failure for that to happen. For there to be a public outcry enough to say that the generals need to say, oh man, we really need a better rifle.
Right.
Otherwise, small arms are really not that big of a deal. Why one nation switches from one caliber to another or from one rifle to another, it really isn't based on that much strategy. In the US and the UK it is, in Europe it sometimes is, but other countries not so much. So small arms though are an indication of these greater ties, right? So small arms are usually like the icing on a cake, right? So it's kind of like they get chucked in there along with bigger negotiations. So it's like, oh, we're gonna, this country is gonna help out that country with like oil reserves and this and that. And oh, by the way, we'll upgrade your small arms program as well from 7.62 to 5.56. And that's like, oh, check. Oh, great, we get a more modern rifle. That's cool. But if we didn't get a more modern rifle, that'd be fine as well, So, and you take that to mean in that the small arms development in Burma has always tied itself to larger political partners like Israel and West Germany. So it's like Israel's relationship to Burma was crucially important for Burma. The small arms aspect of it happened, but it was like Burma did not solidify very good relations with Israel just to upgrade their small arms programming. No, it was the relationship began, and it was very important. And then the small arms development and indigenous production of Israeli designs in Burma was kind of like, yeah, we need that. Yeah, make it happen anyways. But if that didn't happen, then they'd probably still continue with the G3 series, the BA62, the BA72, and the BA63, for example. So that's something to really take into account with these relationships. Like, what's the bigger picture? What's the bigger country behind this? And they come out through the small arms aspect of it, whatever it is in terms of the design and the development.
And was as you were a kid, just going around and learning about the different weaponry that existed at these different posts, as you were building that catalog and you were looking at what the patterns were within that catalog, did that add up or relate to this insight about the relationship with Israel specifically?
Not really. Not really until later, once you put all the big pieces together, because you're too busy putting little puzzle pieces together, right? You're too busy thinking like, okay, how did they get this front sight post done? Or how did they get the design for this? Or how did they get this done? And stuff like that. That's the more important thing at that point. You're not really thinking of the bigger picture. You're not like, oh, that makes sense. That's why this company did this at that time because of this geopolitical relationship. You just know, like, okay, Burma and Israel, they're strong together. Boom. That's important. I have to keep that in mind. That's why the design of this handguard is the same as that one on the Israeli version. That's important. But beyond that, because as a technical specialist, you're in the weeds so much that you can't deviate into bigger stuff. It doesn't make a difference, because what you're trying to do as a technical small arms researcher is you're looking for the itty bitty grainy details of variants and derivatives of patterns, and when they were introduced, when they were phased out, who's still using them, how are they still using them, was it in combat, was it not in combat, that kind of stuff. You are so ingrained in that. The bigger relation stuff is kind of just a backdrop. It's kind of like, oh yeah, well, okay, strong relationship with Israel, got it. That's why these two designs match up. Moving on. That's the aspect I took to it as a technical small arms researcher, right? Now, there's other kinds of small arms researchers that are not so technical and don't really care about it. They don't get in the weeds, and they're the kinds of people that are like, big relationship, Israel and Burma, or Germany and Burma, or Singapore, or Korea and Burma. It's like, what's going on here? But as a technical guy, it's like you can't be concerned with that kind of thing a lot of the time.
So can you, I know this was probably on your part, a multi-year, probably even longer than that, experience of going through this mystery and this puzzle to get to the other side and start to see where the pieces fit. Can you give us some very brief snapshot of maybe aha moments, or maybe when certain patterns started to become clear, take us through at warp speed of going from a technical specialist who's just trying to get serial numbers and pictures and a basic understanding of individual weapons to the bigger picture? How did that process take shape for you?
I don't know. I think in terms of once I started connecting with other researchers and connecting with other people, and my research started getting published more and more, and I started getting in contact with more people, and especially, getting in contact with more Burmese enthusiasts about this kind of thing. That's when things kind of like, wow, I'm like coming full circle now, and expanding that reach, right? I think that's where that happened. One of the aha moments for sure was there was a weapons program in the 1990s called the Earmark 1 or something, the EMERK1. And in the Irrawaddy and in some other places, people were people were jumping to conclusions they should not have been jumping into at all. And this is where it paid, like, you need people on the ground looking at the firearms in person, like dissecting them and taking them apart. There's no amount of open source research or OSINT or like online, whatever, that's going to replace somebody looking at that gun and checking it out with the right knowledge in hand. And this is an example of that, because there's the Earmark series in the 90s on the gas pipeline in Karen and Mon State. People started freaking out about it and saying, is this a Burmese connection to China? Is Burma copying the QBZ bulp up? Jump into all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. And pictures were out of it. And people were like, people went from Burma might have a bulp up to Burma and China are going to rule the world now. Like it was unnecessary, because I was able to take pictures of it and get right up on it at the Defense Services Museum in Naypyidaw. And it wasn't until I showed it to another researcher that we both looked at it, and he said, that's a totally fake gun. It's a non-gun. It's just made out of wood and paper mache and plastic and metal.
Wow.
And we were able to look closely at it, and I was like, yeah, you're absolutely correct. So the whole Earmark thing was fake. It was a nothing. It looks like a firearm from afar. Yeah, it looks like, it's a working bulb, but if you actually get up right on it, it's like, this is just a mock-up. So that's something that was a big aha kind of thing with that particular design, and being like, well, everybody thought this thing was a gun this whole time. It's not. It's just a mock-up prototype that led to nothing. So don't jump to your conclusions before you have your evidence in hand, right? So
Sure.
that was a big deal with that. Other moments, very interesting moments, I would say, is sort of talking to people who would go against this stuff. There was a particular moment I remember when I was talking to some Karen guys who were telling me that they were consistently finding like 50 caliber cases out in the jungle, but single cases. I had known that the Burmese had a 50 caliber anti-materiel rifle. I had known about the existence of it, but I hadn't known about the field use of it in combat. Now, the Karen had known about they had found these 50 caliber, 50 BMG cases, but they didn't know what was shooting them. Because as far as they knew, the only thing that was shooting them was heavy machine guns. And heavy machine guns don't leave behind a case or two. They leave behind a mountain of cases. And especially in that jungle combat, it's like, no, they're shooting and then they're moving. There's no time to pick that stuff up. You're moving all the time. And you can't really carry it with you because your weight is king. So when they told me that, I said, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about this 50 caliber anti-materiel rifle. And they said, aha, that's exactly what's out there and what we're up against. And they told me that, and I knew that now the Burmese are actually employing this thing in combat. Because a lot of countries will say, well, we'll have these guns on parade or whatever, and they'll have them. There's a difference between having a capability and actually using it. A lot of people will claim that they're using something or actually are using it in the field, but they're actually not. They're actually just saying that they have it. And that was a big difference for sure. So.
And I think in your catalog as well, as you started to collect information about all these small arms, I think I remember you saying that there was one of the things that struck you was the vast diversity of where all these weapons had come from, when they had come from, what condition they were in. You were also tracking serial numbers with that. Tell us a bit about your experience in building this catalog and some of the mysteries that came of, well, how did this come from here? Why would you I never expect to find this piece here. What stands out in terms of as you were gathering and collecting this information?
I think one of the biggest thing was the SKSs, was the M21 SKSs. And all the Burmese, for some reason, thought they were from Yugoslavia. The interesting thing is you always have to account for what people tell you in the field, like the emic and the etic perspective, right? Because Yugoslavia was a major supplier of illicit arms to Burma, particular Yugoslavian arms dealer, right? Now the M21 was fascinating because it was a sanitized Chinese SKS carbine that the Chinese actually produced this whole series of firearms, of small arms that were under what was called the M20 series. And these were sanitized. What I mean by that is they had no Chinese markings. All the markings on it were had English, Arabic numeral numbers. So if they were captured, and the Chinese produced this during the Vietnam War era, so they could hand these out to, allied nations, and then they could use them in fights, but they wouldn't have a direct tie to China. And they had the M20 Tokarov, which was a handgun, the M21, which was the SKS, the M22, which was an AK-47, or a milled AK, and then they had the M23, which was an RPD, which baffled me for the longest time until I finally saw a version of it in the Chinese military museum of an M23 marked RPD. And that was my nail in the coffin. I had suspected that the RPD that there was a Chinese M23 RPD for many years until I saw that one piece, and that finally confirmed it. And I was like, yeah, there is one. But the M21 SKS was very interesting because as a kid, I was collecting all these SKSs and I was like, who makes the M21? And on the internet and everyone I asked, and no one knew who made the M21. Right. So I was like, what the heck? Come on, someone has to know. And I was like, and it really, a lot of these early finds back then, really baffled me and really sort of shook my confidence as a gun guy. Cause I was like, I don't even, am I doing something wrong here? Am I looking up the wrong thing? Am I reading the wrong books? It's like, are all the books I'm reading wrong? If none of these have this M21 SKS in there, So that was something that was a big deal to me, right? And then I finally found out later, it's like, okay, yeah, the M21 SKS, that's actually kind of well known within certain intelligence circles, but not the larger community. So that was there. Then the other thing was the Singaporean M16s. Kind of, these things are just, hiding in plain sight. Like, and that's where it's like, you look at an M16 and it's like, oh, that's an M16, probably from the Vietnam War era. And it's like, no, it's from made in Singapore, probably after the Vietnam War. And those were the Mod 613 M16s produced in Singapore. And that was interesting to find out. So not all M16s are created equal, right? You look at a lot of the M16s there, yeah, they did come from the Vietnam War era. A lot of them were actually were actually handed off to Cambodia. And you had a lot of these cross-Thailand illicit gun runs, bringing in semi-trucks of M16s from Cambodia to the Karen and then being captured and them showing up by the Burmese police, right? So that was interesting. That was something that stood out. Some of the other weird stories, I mean, you had Egyptian greeners, greener shotguns that were originally made for Egyptian contracts that used special ammunition. The ones they had in Burma didn't use that special ammunition. But it was so essentially, if a prisoner stole a shotgun and ran away with it, he couldn't just load it up with anything. That was interesting. You have a number of weird, crazy stuff. M1 carbines, from Second World War and afterwards, that were in use. That was like real. Those were, the M1 carbines in the Lee Enfields were some of the cooler rifles that I definitely, messed with over there, because I would just pick them up. And as a kid, like, man, like this is the rifle that like stormed Normandy or did this or did that. It's like the real historical connection was like, I'm 15 in Yangon holding an M1 carbine that's still in active use. Right. It's like, it was a crazy experience to like experience that for the first time, So.
So what are the implications of that? What do you think? I mean, especially having some of the weirder ones about like finding weaponry that's made in Singapore or something, or found its way to Egypt. Were you just left kind of holding this mystery of just kind of establishing, okay, this gun is actually from this place and somehow it ended up here? Or were you able to make any hypotheses or even go beyond that and develop some theories as to what it meant that you were finding these weapons made in these kind of unusual places ending up in Yangon?
Well, the hypotheses with the Burmese is that they never throw anything away.
Right.
As long as it's working, they keep using it, and they cannibalize parts. They refurbish wood. They paint it over. They keep what they have, and that is a recurring theme. Whether when looking at like sort of third world economies or third world small arms dynamics, because you see the same thing in Iraq and Syria. You just don't throw anything away. If it still works, you use it. Or if it's broken or somewhat messed up, you make it work somehow or another. You just don't throw it away. That's something we don't understand in the U.S. Right. And the Burmese are able to keep things in service for a very long time, many years after they're decommissioned everywhere else in the world. They're able to keep things still running. I mean, the Karen do it on another insane level. They rebarrel and rechamber stuff into different calibers. And you're like, what? This is a G3 barrel in a Lee Enfield stock shooting like 5.56, or my favorite one is an M16 barrel in a Lee Enfield stock shooting Burmese 5.56. That's one of the most insane that's one of the crazier creations I've seen when it comes to small arms. It's like a combination of all those three would not be normal, would not exist if it weren't for the economies that at play there, where you got shot out M16 barrels, you got Lee Enfields you don't have ammunition for, you got Burmese ammunition that can't be shot through M16s. It's like you got to make them all work, so you put them all together and you make it work. So that's something there. I mean it's just like all these weird relationships that the Burmese have, and they have to skirt around things. They have to use captured arms, they have to use stuff from World War II. They have to make these weird deals with Singapore and Korea. They have to have this extensive relationship with Israel to skirt around the rest of the world as well. They lose their ability to use anything West German, so they have to cut. Fritz Werner cuts off their ties and stuff. Fritz Werner and Rheinmetall. So it's like, it's just the story of small arms in any of these weird places. It's just like it's telling the story of the country and all the weird backgroundness that comes into it. I mean, the Yugoslavian thing, the Yugoslavian Tokarovs were sold to Burma for a while, and then you've got a bunch of them flowing around. You have one of the rarer high powers that collectors like to get, marked Burma Army, that were a high power contract from the 1950s. So yeah.
Right. So this, and as you built up this catalog, and you were, and again, this is happening organically. It's starting as a game, and then suddenly you find that you're having this intelligence research that you're doing. It's being published. The overall amount of data that you collected and then shared. I guess a two-part question. One is that were there other people like you that were collecting this kind of information, or working at it from a different angle, or publishing, analyzing in different ways? And then two, the other corollary of that question is the work that you were doing. Where did it end up going? Where did this raw data that you were putting out there? Were there other scholars or analysts that were then, or even intelligence services that were then taking that and perhaps moving the ball a bit more down the field and analyzing and understanding it beyond the capacity of what you could do when you're collecting it?
Yeah, I've kind of like it. I know it is safe to say nobody has written more about Burmese small arms than me in English language, in small arms journals and reports in the Western world. Like, full stop, period. Nobody else has written as much as me, and I am humble in saying that, and I know it's the truth because I've written it, and I've seen everything else. I've researched everything else. I'm going in tails on it. So, but as a result of that, I kind of get parried back and forth, and there's various researchers at various times I've crossed paths with, and then gotten in touch with, or they've gotten in touch with me. I had wooden as a kid, as a high schooler, I had wooden laboratories reach out to me in a handwritten note asking me about cartridge head stamps from the DVI. And I didn't even know what wooden laboratories was. And later on as an adult, I found out, wow, wooden laboratories reached out to me? Like, they're actually a really big deal in that sense. So, I don't know. It's kind of cyclical as well. It's like, as I go on, like, people get in touch, and then I share what I have, or I help with what I have, and then I move on, or they move on, and that kind of thing. So, I don't know, in terms of intelligence services, none of the intelligence services have either they're interested in my work and they consume it, or they just don't, or they don't tell me, or they don't want to get in touch with me. I don't know. But it's definitely out there in the public domain, in Small Arms Review, in Recoil, on the Vickers Guide, Volume 2, in the Free Burma Rangers Field Recognition Guide that gets passed out to any NGO that wants or asks for it. That exists. Small Arms Survey as well. I don't know. It's out there for sure.
So we're talking about the research that you did into the small arms of the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army. Did you conduct any research or have any analysis of some of the different EAOs that are out there and the small arms they employ?
Yeah, slightly, and to a fair degree, but not as much as the Tatmadaw. Tatmadaw was that was the big fish for sure, because the EAOs are just tough. They're tough to research a lot of times. With the Karen, there's a lot of interesting things going on, but the most fascinating is definitely with the Wa and then the Kachin. Those are the second to first big fish in Burma where it comes to small arms stories and research, because the Wa and the Kachin are making their own stuff, and that's where your eyes go up and say, wow, they're actually producing this in the jungle, and they're not only producing it and making it themselves, but they're selling it to the other EAOs. So it's now become like an industry in of itself in Burma, whereas before it was a cottage industry. You had different factions. You had different EAOs, making their stuff, and really it was more craft production and improvised production of things. And the PDF continue that to this day by working with 3D printed things and making very improvised and crudely produced small arms. But the Kachin and the Wa, did take it up to the whole next level of industrial production of small arms because of their proximity to China and ability to work with Chinese machinery and technical advice, and possibly implicit Chinese support as well on some level, right?
Tell us a bit more about that. Tell us what you've learned about small arms production in Kachin and Wa.
Well, the Wa for sure are known for it. And the Wa were known colloquially for it. I mean, like sort of around the EAOs is okay. That's a Wa AK. This is a Chinese AK, and they're roughly identical to each other. And then the Wa have a number of different variants, but it essentially comes around the Kalashnikov and the Type 81 production within both. The Kachin also produce their own mortars. Both or one of them has their own RPG or grenade launcher variants as well. But the interesting thing I would also say as well is the amount of variants and derivatives that exist between those two, between the Kachin and the Wa, is very telling, because it's one thing to produce, a firearm of any type. The next level is actually producing a variant and saying, okay, we're going to make it with this stock in this particular configuration or this variant, with this type of furniture or this barrel length, or now we're going to shoot rifle grenades from it. And all those different differences. That means you have to retool production. You got to change up the production line. You have to add this. You have to test this, and that is sort of a sign of an that is a sign of a very mature arms production facility. The ability to create variants, to create prototypes, to test variants, and then to produce them as well. And the interesting thing about both the Wa and the Kachin is that they make enough to arm themselves, and then they sell it to everybody else. I mean, and now you have Karen, Karenni, Arakan, different other EAOs, purchasing brand new rifles, from them all. And that's showing up all over the place too. So it's like, not only are they producing arms of their own accord, but now they're actually arming all the other EAOs. Whereas before, the other EAOs had to deal with, and themselves, right? Prior to the 1990s and 2000s, I mean, definitely the Kachin and maybe the Wa, they only had to purchase surplus stuff from elsewhere. They only had to deal with the leftover AKs from wars gone past and, old M16s and all sorts of stuff. They had no other choice. But now they're actually making their own. They control their own arms making destiny. So that's an interesting point there.
So when you're talking now, I assume you're talking post-coup. You're talking the last 2 years of the emerging civil war, that this is taking shape among the different EAOs.
No, the Kachin have been producing since at least the last decade. Within the last decade, they've started. The Wa have been producing before that.
And selling.
Oh, selling somewhat, but the selling has accelerated since the coup greatly. Selling that happened pre-coup for sure in 2018. But to the extent that it exists now, no. Now they're all over. And now, the Karen colloquially refer to the Wa Type 81s as a Wa AK. It's not really an AK, it's a Type 81. But they refer to it as a Type 81, as a Wa AK. So it's even got a name now. Whereas before you had Karen who would say, okay, this AK here, this is from Wa. They don't call it a Wa AK. They just say, no, it's from Wa State. Like, I bought it from a Wa guy who brought it here. That's how I know it's from Wa. But there was no common name for it saying it was Wa. But now there's a name for it, and people say, no, this is a Wa AK. It's like, the secret's out in the open, so to speak.
And is the military trying to stop this? I mean, especially after the coup, the Wa are somewhat in their own autonomous area, and there haven't, as far as I know, there haven't been direct skirmishes. And yet, if you're describing that the arms that they're producing and selling are then the major source of which is then being turned against the military, I would think that there would be some action the past 2.5 years to want to curtail that from happening.
Yeah. I mean, in Karen, you have corrupt Burmese commanders and corrupt Burmese bases that are actually selling their own ammunition to local Karen, who then in turn give it to the KNLA and then use it against the Burmese.
That's insane.
So you've got like this weird dynamic of like they're fighting the people they also supply at the same time. So you've got stuff like that going on locally. So
I don't even know what to say to that.
Yeah, so to have the Wa be able to transport that stuff, it's probably right up there with the opium shipments that get to the Thai border, and it's like, okay, we're gonna dump this opium on the Thai border, and then we're gonna sell all these Type 81s to the Karenni and then the Karen or something. So it's the same, drugs, guns, and on all that illicit stuff follow a lot of the same paths and routes and
Hmm.
touch points, so to speak, right?
And are you finding that since the coup, there's been an increase in supply of all of those?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
You see so-called YAKs. I mean, all over Karenni. I mean, you see it in the social media. You don't even need to be there to see that.
Hmm.
You look at Karenni fighters, and it's like they all have these WA Type 81s. And then you see it in Arakan as well. With Arakan buying a lot from the Kachin because it's a very distinctive rifle that the Kachin make too.
The AA, you
Kachin,
mean?
yeah, the Arakan, the
Mhm.
Arakan army. You see them with a lot of these Kachin rifles too. Yeah.
So one of the things we've been hearing for the past year is just how much the PDFs are undersupplied, how they have a fighting spirit, but they just don't have any material to actually do anything. So we're talking about the Kachin and Wa made materials getting to the other ethnics, but what about the PDFs? I mean, you talked briefly about just the attempts at this crude 3D printing, but what is the story with the PDFs getting access to their own weaponry?
I think it depends per PDF at how well they're supplied, how well connected they are, how much they are trusted by the EAOs that they work alongside. I mean, that is so situationally dependent
Mm,
across the entire country. You can't say like the PDFs are badly
sure, sure.
armed or well
Yeah.
armed. It's like
Hmm.
in some places they got some Gucci kit. In other places they're slingshotting grenades. you know
Mm.
so it depends really where they are and what they're doing, in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. Yeah.
And where does the NUG fit into these connections between acquiring and transporting and arming the appropriate defense groups? So, if any, is there any role they're playing in it, or is it mainly just there are so, as we know, there's so many PDF groups spread across the country now, and splintering groups and various names of local defense forces? Is the NUG not so much involved, and it's really just the character and nature of those personal relationships on the ground and the charisma and the character of the individual leaders of those units?
Yeah, I don't think the NUG is involved at all. I mean,
Mm,
these armed trafficking networks have been around for decades. Since the Second
right.
World War, right? And people are always hunting for more guns, and they're always wanting to get more stuff. So it's like, however they make it happen, they make it happen. It's like they don't need the NUG to help them with that. It's like they're don't worry. Like if any of the EAOs want to get better stuff and they have funding for it, they will. Like, because they need it and they know they need it.
Mm,
And it's just an amount of funding. Honestly, I mean, because you can only support yourself with captured Burmese stuff to a certain extent. You cannot
mhm,
fight a war off of captured material. Captured material usually is nice. It supplements your armory, and it's kind of an extra bonus on top. It's like, oh, great, yeah, we captured a couple Burmese rifles and some ammunition. But it's like, yeah, but you don't have the backlog of support for it. You don't have the spare parts for it. The ammunition that the Burmese use
mhm,
doesn't even work in an M16 because it
mhm,
jams up or fails catastrophically. Which is another very fascinating antidote that I haven't seen anywhere else in the world, where in Burmese ammunition, Burmese 5.56 will not function correctly most of the time in an American produced 5.56 M16. And
mhm,
that's something that is known within all the ethnic groups. It says do not shoot Burmese ammunition in an M16 if you can avoid it. Okay, if that's all the ammo you got, okay, go ahead, but be aware, like, that's going to jam and it might blow up your rifle. So that's something that is kind of interesting. In that, was that a design intent or a fluke on the
mhm,
part of the Burmese? Did the
mhm,
Burmese intentionally, work with different powders and intentionally find a way to isolate the M16 and say we're gonna produce rounds that work well in our rifles, but then blow up the other side's rifle? Or did they just that's a complete fluke and they're like, this just happens to blow up an M16 when you
mhm,
put it in it? I don't
mhm,
know. I think it's more the effort of this just happens to blow it up. I don't think it's an intentional thing very much. But if it was, it's like that's like
mhm,
some secret genius we got going on. But I don't think
mhm.
that's the case. They're too worried about getting their rifles to function to begin with.
Sure.
So
Yeah. So to clarify my last question, I think there maybe was some miscommunication. I wasn't asking if the NUG is involved in getting different ethnic groups their weapons. Of course, I know the different ethnic groups would be in charge of that. I'm talking more about the relationship between the PDFs and the NUG. And I know that's quite a complicated thing to entangle. It's also not a monolithic answer, but there is a Ministry of Defense, and some of the PDFs are within the umbrella of the MOD. Some are not, and the MOD, as well as various other ministries of the NUG, has been involved in looking at how they can support these defense groups that are protecting local regions from military attacks, and sometimes we just see there's just fundraisers out on social media, and especially in Burmese online spaces of different groups that are trying to raise money for different defense funds. And I don't know exactly where that money goes in terms of what they procure or how they procure it, but but we also hear news anecdotally. You're on the ground and I'm not, but hearing news about different PDF groups that just simply don't have anything left and are needing to find that material in some way. And so, have there been explorations that you know of looking at these Kachin and Wa factories that could be supporting some of the different PDF groups? And I don't know what the NUG's involvement with that would be, or if that would be more of a direct relationship with those individual defense forces.
Yeah, that's a very complicated answer.
Yeah.
I think the PDFs are just stuck at the bottom of the barrel and they're just scrounging, because the EAOs are scrounging enough as it is. So it's like, if the EAOs are like, oh man, we just got this new shipment of WA Type 81s, like we only got 10 of them, and we got 20 of us, and then 10 of that PDF squad over there. No, you're not going to get any of these Type 81s. This is for us. I think that's just the bare bones reality, is that yes, like, okay, some of the EAOs are allied with different PDFs in some capacity, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, but we're not going to give you our best stuff though. You got to find your own. I think that's the reality that a lot of.
So there's not enough good stuff coming from these Kachin and Wa factories to be able to spill over to the PDFs. It sounds like there's barely enough for the EAOs to get some modicum of what they want.
Oh yeah. There's definitely not enough for the EAOs. I mean, the WA are selling it, but I'm willing to bet that the WA are not selling as much as they'd want to the EAOs. It's kind of it's kind of like, why doesn't more of this demographic doesn't have more Rolexes? It's like, well, that demographic doesn't have the funds to afford that many Rolexes. So like I think that's what it comes down to in that.
And you talked about the crude 3D printing that some PDFs have experimented with and trying to have some kind of arms. What do you know about how that process has gone?
I mean, there's only those isolated videos that I've seen on social media. I haven't actually seen one of those in person. It's a party trick. I mean, great, you made a gun out of plastic. That's awesome. But the thing is, like, a gun needs a firearm or rifle that a soldier is going to carry into battle. It needs to function, and it needs to function reliably. And if it doesn't function reliably, that soldier is not going to trust it, and he's not going to want to use it. And that's a very integral part of his kit. So having something like a 3D gun, it's like, that's awesome for a couple shots or a burst or two or a magazine or two. But after that, how's it going to function then? I'll tell you one of the worst things that exists though is you have these airsoft components, these BB guns that look like M16s, that look like M4s, that are produced. One of them is this company that was produced in Taiwan from a Taiwanese airsoft company, and a bunch of those were making them to Burma. And they were not, they weren't real M4s. They were airsoft lower receivers and airsoft components kind of worked together with what we call real steel barrels and bolts. So real bolts and barrels, like, coming together from parts kits coming from somewhere, I don't know, either probably not produced, but maybe coming from US parts kits or something. And a lot of the EAOs are still using them to this day. And they don't have a choice, because they say either I use this thing that works a lot of the time, but it rusts in a couple months, or I don't use anything at all. So that's the real terrible part about that.
I've heard other talk about the MOD and other ministries in the NUG exploring the possibility of setting up their own small arms manufacturing factory somewhere in some liberated area that they control. Have you heard anything about that? And what would be the challenges or difficulties of trying to do that at this time?
Incredibly difficult. The best that you could do is parts manufacture, is producing smaller components, because a lot of the problem that a lot of these old rifles have is that they're just getting old, they're wearing down, and in the jungle a lot of stuff rots or rusts or all sorts of things. And if you can produce the small components, that's something that's quite doable. You can produce a lot of the components using various 3D printing measures or various other ways to service the components, right? It's not a matter of getting the product, it's a matter of maintaining the product. That's something that's definitely doable, but it hasn't really been done in a lot of ways. There was, you can look on the internet, there was an attempt to CNC M16 lower receivers in Mesa that got seized by the Thais a couple years back, and that's online. So you can see that. But that's about it that exists there. It's like small arms manufacturing is tough because you have to be precise, you have to know what you're doing, you can't waste metal. And it has to work, it has to function under stress, right? It's a different kind of manufacturing than, say, producing, thermoses or a shelf, for example.
Sure. Yeah, right. I realize the next question I'm going to ask might be a bit out of the scope in what we're talking, so you can let me know if you have an opinion or analysis, or if it's a bit overwhelming from the more technical conversation we're having. But just I realize as we're talking about the access and possibility of different small arms for different groups and what that means for the current conflict, the bird's eye question of that is what would actually help at this time. And we hear conflicting things from conflicting opinions from different sides. Some sides obviously saying resistance and defense, saying we just need more weapons. If we were able to have more weapons, we'd be able to defend ourselves more and that's what the democracy movement, like Ukraine and resisting the Russian aggression. This is what the resistance forces need in Myanmar to finally be able to resist and overcome the Tamana aggression. Of course, the other side of that is that these weapons don't go away, and that and that by pouring more weapons and more ability to fight and kill in the country, that you're just creating a future balkanization that's just going to get bloodier and worse as time goes on. Really need to look at solutions outside of this. That's obviously somewhat as accurate as that might be in one way. It's obviously a privileged thing to say for those who aren't living in villages that are facing these terrible attacks and have no means to defend themselves. Do you have an opinion or thought about where you come down on your analysis between this range of opinions and views?
You bring up Ukraine, and the answer to Ukraine, the thing that made the difference in Ukraine wasn't generally more weapons. It was specifically more quality weapons and weapons to defeat the Russian threat, which in the beginning of the Ukrainian, of the Russian offensive, the answer was javelins and NLAWs. And those were very specific. We could make a reference to the U.S. Stingers in Afghanistan, but there's a lot of the controversy there. The U.S. supply of Stingers to the Mujahideen did not finish or end the war. It made a difference, but it wasn't overly strategic. Because when the U.S. introduced Stingers, 1986, the Mujahideen was all like, the Russians were already in their sort of like, man, we're looking for a way out already. They hadn't, the Mujahideen hadn't completely been crushed, right? The Stingers were introduced too late in the war. They did make a difference, but it's like the war was already going a certain course. Now, And the way Russian helicopters responded to those stingers is they changed their flight profiles, they altered their time on landing zones, etc. They were able to deal with them, right? They were able to alter their tactics. But in Ukraine, for example, it was the NLAWs, it was the triumph of technology of the NLAWs and the javelins that made the difference against Russian armor, where the Russians just fell to pieces when all their tanks started blowing to bits all around them. So it was very specific, right? It wasn't a million M4s that made the difference in Ukraine. No.
Right.
In fact, Ukraine has a huge surplus of small arms besides man portable or man pads that make a difference, right? So, but the difference in the Burmese context is something like that. In low altitude air defense weapons will change the battlefield entirely. I mean, everyone's calling for early warning. Why do you need early warning when you can blow that thing out of the sky? Now, okay, but the difference with a man pad is that you want something that is effective at those lower altitudes, so you can hit helicopters, so you can hit low flying aircraft, and where it turns into something like Ukraine, where they shoot down a Malaysian airliner. That's where things get kind of out of the way for it, right? That's where you get like a plane flying from Bangkok to India that gets blown out of the sky over one of these EAO areas. That type of weapon system would make a tremendous difference for the EAOs, because the EAOs, they have the strategy, they have the guts, they have the ability to take the Burmese head on in a lot of places. They have that ability, but what they don't have is the ability to deal with the air power, and that's these low altitude air defense weapons, which the Burmese have air superiority of the sky. They're completely unmolested. And if you had some of these air defense weapons, that would completely change the game. And in Ukraine, it's changing the game because as both sides in Ukraine, like neither side has air superiority over the other. Like everyone thought Russia would knock out the Ukrainian Air Force on the first day of the war. They didn't. And both sides' use of air power, they go up to the line of contact and maybe a little bit beyond it, but they don't go further in because of the air defense capability of both sides, right? So it makes a big difference. So if the EAOs had that would be a tremendous tipping point. Not more M4s, not more of that. That would definitely help too. But if you had that kind of ability, huge. It'd be tremendous.
And is there any hope of getting that?
Not really, because the people that own that stuff, like the US and the European countries that really advanced air defense systems, they're reluctant to give that out because they don't want another Malaysian airliner being blown out of the sky, as in Ukraine. Now, but the thing is, what blew the Malaysian airliner out of the sky was a massive air defense piece. I mean, I don't even know the name of it. It was, something on four wheels that, launched and hit an airliner at, 10,000 feet. But the EAOs don't need to hit anything at 10,000 feet. They need to hit everything at 5,000 and 4,000 feet and below. That's what's going to make a big difference.
You referenced before about how well armed and trained and courageous the different ethnic fighting units are, and inferred that if they were that they'd be able to hold their own and more against the Burmese military, albeit with the superior air power that the Burmese military definitely has. But looking at the current nature and status of the different ethnic armed organizations in terms of their the weapons they can bring to bear, their fighting units, their morale, and then the Burmese military, how would you differentiate or analyze the makeup of these different fighting groups right now?
I mean, it totally depends on the group. I mean, some groups are extremely poorly armed. Other groups, like extremely poorly armed, low amount of funding. Other groups have a lot of funding, and they produce their own stuff. The Wa and the Kachin, the Arakan, for example, the AA, they don't produce their own stuff, but they've got a lot of funding somehow, some way, and they're able to buy a lot from the Wa and the Kachin. And you can see, you go online and you can see all that. You don't need to be an Arakan state to see that. There's a lot of modern day stuff that's with the Arakan army, and it just depends on the group. I mean, some are well off, some aren't. Right.
Mm. Right. So, like, just going from your knowledge of those different groups and where they're at now, and then looking at where the Burmese military is now, how would you break down where those different groups are standing, the different status of what they have and how capable they are?
Well, the WA for sure, like take the
Hmm.
top cake for sure. The WA have their own, air defense, low altitude air defense missiles, right? They have that
Hmm.
kind of stuff, Soviet era kind of things. The and the WA are one of the biggest standing armies, like one of the largest standing armies, like in Southeast Asia, like with the amount
Hmm.
of troops that they have to bear, in the capacity that they are, like. If you want to compare what kind of funding they have and stuff, right, compared to these other Southeast Asian countries,
Hmm.
the WA for sure, and then the Kachin, come up next because they're second runner up because they produce their own stuff as well,
Hmm.
and then Arakan Army, and then after Arakan Army, you probably go down the line of some of the Shan contingent groups, and then the Karen and the Karenni. The Karenni are definitely ranked in the lower part there as well because the Karenni, they have more troops than they have fighters. Like they're off by a lot, but they make up for that in their ability to bring the fight to the enemy, and they're
Right. Yeah.
extremely
Hmm.
courageous in that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, and the next question gets into again a bit more wider than the more technical areas that we're talking about. But you might have an opinion on this. When we met each other last month, we were in the course of one conversation. Someone who was also there, that was on the ground, made the reference. Then is also connected to many of these different ethnic organizations. Reference that if there was a way to bring some of these ethnic fighting forces out, the military wouldn't last a week. It would be over instantaneously. I'm sure that's a analysis that you would sympathize with, and yet that hasn't happened, and there's no real hope of that happening. So, what's your thought on? And you referenced just now the Karenni are one of the few groups that are actually taking the fight to the enemy as opposed to the others. What are your thoughts on the difficulties and challenges of having some of those other fighting forces be able to have any kind of coalition, much less even it's not a coalition, just being able to go out to go beyond from defending their own areas to being able to take the fight to the Burmese military.
I think that's quite, it's there, like if you had like a coalition like converging on Yangon and Mandalay and Naypyidaw, kind of thing, like that is I think that's like future talk. That is tough. So
Hmm.
many of these groups just want to hold on to what they got and they just want to
Hmm.
stay there. They don't have the capacity to go beyond what they got in a
Hmm.
lot of ways. They're
Yeah,
barely
yeah,
holding on in so many
right,
ways. It's
right.
like offensive. It's like no, every act is defensive. You can't go on the offense when you're still fighting the good defense. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
you can't. It's too difficult for so many of them. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the arms to support it. And I think for a lot of them, I mean, you look at you listen to some of the Karenni talk, and they're like, man, we're just trying to get them out of our land here. It's like
Hmm.
we weren't even a part of this mess until this coup happened, and now we all joined up to like get up against it. So that tells you it's like they don't really. And you hear a lot of Karenni talk, and they're still talking about uniting the country. It's like there isn't an interest to go
Hmm.
into Yangon and like
Hmm.
do everything. If all the ethnic groups could say, hey, if tomorrow we can just click our fingers and we'll all just be at peace and we'll all get the sort of federated democracy we want. It's like that's all we want. We don't want to raise Yangon to the ground. Like
Hmm.
let's just leave us alone. I think that's the end goal. The end goal is not to stream into Yangon like in
Sure.
like in Saigon '79, right?
Yeah, and that's
So
why a lot of analysts that I've been seeing reports of lately have been predicting just a very long, protracted standstill. That we're not having the resistance forces be able to have the will or the means to be able to come together to defeat the common enemy, and the enemy itself, the Burmese military, does not have the means or ability to be able to fight battles on so many fronts and take over the country. And so we're looking at a period of both sides just kind of being dug in as continued bloodshed happens, and perhaps there continues to be not much intervention or support from neighboring countries or the international community. What's your outlook on where we stand and where we're going from here?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's perspective is such an important thing, right? So I've heard, like, I heard a PDF guy talk about, and he only recently joined up, right, within the past like 2 years or something since the coup. We joined up since the coup, and I literally heard him relate a story of how, the top medal is on the downhill. They're using rice, like wicker baskets with straps as their backpacks, because they don't even have backpacks, because they're using wicker baskets with straps. And I didn't say anything to him, but I thought about this, and I was like, I've seen, like, there's images. You can go online and you can see images of Burmese patrols in Karen, like walking around with wicker baskets on their backs as backpacks, as far as a decade plus ago, like even 2 decades ago. So it's just like, everybody's perspective is different, So if you think of that, and I want to take that as like, well, you could look like, that guy's looking at a Burmese column and saying, oh man, they're using wicker baskets as backpacks, like they're on the downhill. It's like they're not doing this, but it's like, no, you actually are just joining this gunfight. You're actually just realizing this for the first second, that they're using wicker baskets as backpacks. It's like they've been using them as rucks for some time. That doesn't mean they're on the downhill. So that's an important point in perspective, knowing it. So I think that's something to take into account on all this. I mean, it's just like, this is kind of like what's epitomized, 1984, in terms of, you have like these 3 great armies, and none of them can like win over each other, but none of them can like ally or beat each other. So you're kind of stuck. And it's like the balance. I think the balance is too, you got 2 forces on a seesaw, and the balance is never going to be totally one way or the other. The Burmese are always going to have the financial funding. They're always going to have the air power. They're always going to have the manpower. The ethnics are always going to have the jungle to hide in. They're always going to have the popular support of the people around them, but they're never going to have the funding. They're never going to have they're not going to have enough funding, so to speak. Because even though the Kachin, have funding to produce their own stuff, it's like they still can't go on the offensive, because they still can't, take that to the Burmese. Because guess what? They don't have air power. So the Burmese have this trump card, right? So they can't. They're both sides are actually balanced out. Until one side becomes unbalanced, that's when things change. That is when things change, but that's not going to happen. And the reality, I think, is that the Burmese on the top, like the top medal, 400,000 men or whatever. It's like the top medal have created the genius of the top medal is that they've created an industry out of the military. The military itself is a state within a state. Yeah. And everybody in the military owes their allegiance to it, their whole livelihoods to it. You've got, this isn't a military, like, this isn't a professional army that exists elsewhere. This is an entire livelihood and industry within itself. Yeah. So it doesn't matter how many men the top medal lose. People are not going to desert, because if you desert, your family has nothing. You've tied your family to that complex. All your food is from there. Everything is from there. If an entire battalion gets wiped out, like, you're going to be like, well, that sucks for them, but I'm still around and I'm still eating pretty good. Why would I? Because the reality also of it is that, yeah, that battalion got wiped out, but there's still another 400 battalions out there that are not wiped out. And as long as you're in one of those other battalions, and if they're only losing, let's say, an entire battalion or an entire company getting wiped out, like, to the man, once a year or once every couple months, that's actually not many compared to a military of 400,000 men. There's actually a lot more guys out there. It's like they can take those losses really well. In fact, you can take 300 men killed, you can take 300 men gone, because you still have a lot more. So until you're losing colossal amounts of men, then it starts making a difference, but still not that much, because it's just a numbers game at that point, and you're not going to beat it, right?
Right. So with the military not quite being able to win and consolidate power, but also not on the verge of losing, does that put you in a somewhat pessimistic outlook in terms of where this is going and how kind of bad and bloody this is going to continue to get when with no solution really in grasp?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a forever war until like because I mean, but there's several trump cards here, right? Air power is one of them. On the battlefield, air power is a trump card. So that's
Mm,
why if EAOs had quality air defense weapon systems and they could take out the aircraft, you lose that trump card, you lose that confidence, and you lose that tactical ability. Because the fact of the
mm,
matter is, on the field, in the field, like the fact that they have air power is their own sort of reserve. If the Burmese have an air power, company commanders and battalion commanders can make bold, risky decisions because they know that as long as they have comm, as long as they have communications, they can always call for air, and
mhm,
air it might or might not come, but if they really push it and they have a good, air to ground and close air support relationship going on, air will come, and
mm,
they know they have that confidence that air will come. They can make this bold move. They can hold out a little longer. They can go places they don't need to, they don't need to. Without that air power, it's like, oh, should I really stay here and fight? Because the downside to fighting here is that, I get completely wiped out. But if they have that air power, it's like, well, I can just call for air, and if comm is up, I'll be good. And I think the other flip side of that coin, the other trump card of that, is that home base of support, that industry. If you start losing that industry of support, if you start losing that military industrial complex, where it becomes hard for the state to maintain families and widowers
mhm.
and everybody in the rear, that's when you start. If that support starts going away and it doesn't become very beneficial to be a member of that complex, that's the other way that can go down as well. And it's like, well, why should I keep on supporting this complex if it doesn't do anything for me in the end? The fact of the matter is, it does a lot for a Burmese private's family. They get to live,
Mhm.
in a family dorm. They get to get a ration of fuel. They're provided for. If the guy gets killed, they get some sort of stipend. They get some sort of monetary compensation. It's like, that's a good deal if you've got nothing, right? So if that goes away, there's less to fight for.
Right. It's good to have understanding of those scenarios and little things that you could pull out or push in and that will make that difference. What possibility do you see of any of those happening, or what actions could be taken to encourage or push things in a direction where the democracy movement can gain that edge?
I don't know. Well, the trump card on the battlefield is air defense weapons, right? That's
Yeah.
that's that.
But you don't see
Um,
that as coming from any actor anytime soon.
Unless the WA are willing to part with some of their stuff.
Hmm.
And if the WA are interested in doing that, that might be a possibility for them. Um, but even then, it's like, I don't know how well the WA's air defense stuff works up against the Burmese MiG 35s and MiG 29s and Mi 8s and stuff like that. Um, I don't know how well it goes up against it. In terms of the home front, I mean, what do you do? Like, starve the population? Like,
Hmm.
like start a plague? Like, introduce locusts into the plains around Yangon and Mandalay? It's like they kill all the crops one year. It's like, I don't know. Like, now that's bordering on like internal genocide, right?
Hmm. Right. You mentioned about the WA. We've been talking about them inside for much of this conversation, and the question just occurred to me: what do we? Because you've been talking about the WA possibly using some of their air defense systems, the fact that they're producing all these weapons that are going to the AOs that are fighting the military. I know there's a long and complicated history between the WA and the Shan and the Chinese and the and the Burmese, of course. But as far as present day goes, what do we know about the relations between the WA army and the Tatmadaw? We know they have their autonomous zone, and they've been largely staying out of direct fighting. But in terms of some, and then and of course, the drug trade is a huge component of this as well. There are many ties there. It's a very complicated question to ask that would be its own podcast to really go and analyze this. But to give us your brief answer, your brief analysis of what do we know of the Wa Tatmadaw relations at this moment, and then how would that play out and affect what the Wa would be willing and not willing to do at this time as the conflict goes on?
We know that the Wa control more of Shan State than we know. I mean, that's for sure. Than is talked about. The Wa control many more cities and areas that is often talked about. I mean, for the people that work there, it's obvious on the ground when you you walk into this city, it's all Wa, and it's only a couple Burmese guys or a couple Tatmadaw guys. But the Wa are in just such a precarious position, and they don't want to mess with anybody else around them. They want to just they have their slice of heaven, and they got China as the backer, and they got the drug trade to keep them going, and they're like, yo, we just want to hold on to our own little piece right here. We're not going to get involved with anybody else unless we can make money, which comes with the small arms sales, right? And again, maybe another way to look at the small arms sales as well, like I said earlier, small arms being sort of an icing on the cake. Is there something else going on that the Wa are doing where it's the small arms sales are actually a sort of secondary thing for the Wa, and they're not actually a primary motive? They're like a secondary sale. What else is happening that I don't know is that within the drug trade that's going on? So I don't know the answer to that at all, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah. Fair enough. Another question I have is I'm thinking of as we're talking about this is as we talk about the standstill, and we're talking about the military dug in their bases in central areas and urban areas especially, and then the ethnic areas also just holding on and defending their homelands and not moving beyond that. The third actor in this that doesn't have that, not to say these other two areas are positions of safety, but the third actor, which is definitely not in a position of safety, are the PDFs and where the PDFs fit into that, and the and those that have joined resistance forces, either local resistance forces of military coming in the area or otherwise, that they seem like they're very vulnerable. And as this conflict stretches on and starts to be, if it's not already become the new normal, what happens to the PDFs and where the PDFs go and what they evolve into, that seems very concerning, and as well as not quite clear as to what their path would be.
I think the PDFs evolve into what the ABSDF did after '88, right? They get folded into the ethnic groups, they peter out, they get sidelined, and their members sort of retire, and they become they go into politics, or they go into other ways of being reporters and stuff. I mean, this is where you see, you meet all these Burma activists who are super old, in their 40s and 50s now. And it's like, what's your story? It's like, oh yeah, protester in Yangon in '88, ABSDF right afterwards until the early '90s. Then I got sick of that, and then I turned into this as a reporter or as a politician, like an outside politician in some way. It's like that's probably the stark reality of it.
Yeah, you referenced that they could be like the '88 ABSDF. The other analysis I've heard is that rather than that, they become like the 1950s KMT, where they the Chinese nationalists, where they become roving bands of marauders, perhaps go to drug or arms trade, get up to other kinds of criminal networks, because they have no home to go to, and their cause starts to become less hopeful, and they just have to find a way to survive off the land of wherever they are.
Yeah, that in of itself is, one of the most crazy metamorphoses of especially how the Wa became to be what they are. It's like Kuomintang getting defeated by CPB, and then CPB itself evaporizing, and then getting taken over by the Wa, and then coming to what it is today. It's like, whoa, how did that happen, right?
It's confusing. It's really confusing.
And it's like, where are we now? But the difference is with the Kuomintang and the CPB is that both of those were organic, units to begin with. They were already a unit on their own. They had already formulated, been under some sort of formal training before. They had some sort of structure. They were rebels. They were literally they became rebels without a cause, right? Whereas the PDF don't have that structure before, and they sort of the PDFs seem more like, rock bands that clash together. They have a bang up time if it is for a couple of years, but then they break apart for various individual reasons and goals and all sorts of different things. I don't know. That might be the cause. That might be the end of the PDFs in that way, and then they go their separate ways.
Yeah, we've already seen that maintaining the morale and the material has been hard enough as it is. And I should just clarify for listeners, you were talking about the CPB. That's the Communist Party of Burma.
Yeah, I don't know.
So I wanted to return to some of the earlier part of our talk, which relates to this part of our talk. You were referencing your investigation into small arms when you were living in Yangon around 2007, 2008. And that's obviously some time ago now. It's 15 years ago that you were doing your research and finding the information. So the information you collected then was based on that current reality and what you were finding as the years have gone by, and especially since the coup developed. Have you been keeping track or following what small arms they have, what they're getting, what you're seeing, what they're using, and then possible implications of that?
Not particularly. My Burmese small arms research kind of ended I've taken a break from it since 2019, I would say. And then it's like what I've done since 2019, I focused much more on the other areas of small arms research, which has been the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, which I'm done with that as well. And right now I'm not doing any small arms research. But I still keep up with it, and I'm aware of developments happening, and some of the newer the WA Type 81s that show up. And then the biggest developments I've seen since the coup are definitely things like the Burmese Glock, and really the biggest thing is the expansion of the Burmese small arms production into working with polymers, elastomers, and polymer molding. And so that shows an indigenous development of plastic components, of frames, of stocks, of things like that, which, guess what, point right back to Israel, in addition to Turkey as well. And there's this whole kebab between Turkey, what was originally, there's this whole relationship between Turkey and Israel, where Turkey would produce a lot of small arms for Israel, but then Israel would say it's really produced there. And there's this because Turkey has this huge small arms industry that is essentially kind of acts like a made in China for small arms. We'll produce whatever you want at whatever quality you want and just brand it however you want as well.
Right.
So Turkey has a lot of that going on. So you have a lot of Israeli arms that go up that way. There's something called the Delta Defense Group, which a derivative of has, showed up in Syria as a Delta Defense pistol, and then is also an Israeli manufacturer, but then now it's also showing up in Burma in some ways. And then you have a lot of CIA designs, a lot of these Israeli aftermarket accessories, which again might be indicative of not a primary effort between the two countries, but maybe Israel and Burma are, when Burma bought the patrol boats, Israel was like, oh, hey, and we'll throw in these aftermarket accessories as well to sweeten the deal kind of thing. So that may have been going on, and you see a lot of that with the MA series, the Burmese small arms there. So that's the biggest new thing in terms of Burmese development on that front.
Right. Well, this has been just so educational for me, and thank you for walking us through your early years and early research, and then up till today and analysis on the coup. We've talked upon so many different areas and so many different angles. I've lobbed a lot of different questions from different perspectives at you, and you've been able to return all of them. So it's been quite impressive and quite educational to learn your insights and your background and extensive experience. There's a lot to talk about. We've talked about a lot on here so far. There's probably a lot more left to be said. So just before we take leave, I wanted to check in. And is there, of all the multitude of questions I've asked, are there things that haven't come up or haven't been talked about, perspectives or different areas that haven't been explored that you might like to touch upon now?
Burma is in terms of small arms research, and this gets into more technicality. There's so much afoot in Burma that is just so undiscovered and such virgin research territory by small arms researchers, like in the field that I used to be in. It's quite disappointing that like nobody has really has an interest to take it on, and it's kind of
Hmm.
it really is because I mean, diving into small arms research in Burma, you can go down some of the most amazing and fantastic rabbit holes of relationships and
Hmm.
geopolitics and last ditch things, and then who double crossed who and backtrack what, and then where things are getting made and what secret
Right.
deals were going on. I mean,
Hmm.
it's all there, right? It's
Hmm.
all these crazy things happening, and also developments in small arms use. And there's designs that are blow your head, blow your mind away. Like, wow, this happened, and you did that, and this design took place, and you
Hmm.
manufactured this, and you're able to figure that out, and how does the 5.56 not work in this or that or anything? And it's all there. It's like the
Right.
whole shebang is there,
Hmm.
but it's untouched, and nobody's interested in it because it's
Hmm.
like the dark hole that Burma is. And it's kind of, I mean, it's just like I mean, it's like, well, no surprise there. It's like the world doesn't care about Burma yet again,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that's something that is the field of small arms study. This field of small arms research in Burma is just as bleak as the field of everything else of study when it comes to Burmese
Mm.
anything. And
Mm.
that's the unpleasant truth that I think is epitomizes it.
Yeah, that's hard to hear, but that's definitely the truth. And whatever, definitely been my experience of many years living there. That whatever the field is that is being talked about, sometimes you're going back to 120 years ago of some colonial report that came out, because that's the last study that's been done in whatever that particular area is. So, I hope that conversations like this on our podcast platform are doing their small part in being able to bring out different voices and different topic areas, plant some seeds. I know that we've had episodes in the past that have truly planted seeds and have set people off on their own missions of scholarship and explorations, whether they're hobby or something more academic, but or more rigorous. But there's a lot of misinformation, and Burma's been the victim for many years, many centuries of reductionist reporting and thinking, reductionist combined with exotified, of being able to tell the simple stories and the non-nuanced approach and messages. And so hopefully conversations like this are getting a bit more into the weeds and presenting more of the nuance and more of the background, not just the answers that we have, but also the many questions that we're all left with, and that they're doing some small part, and people listening having their own interest and starting to pull some other threads and go in different directions with them.
Yeah, it's it's becoming, since the advent of like social media and the internet,
Hmm. Hmm.
like there's been more interest,
Yes, I
but
find that too.
it's kind of like I almost wonder if it's actually there actually hasn't been more interest. It's just the
Hmm.
fact that the internet is around,
Hmm.
that it's like what's the gauge of interest is higher, if that makes any sense. It's like saying like, well, before the advent of maps, nobody knew where China was, but then
Right.
after
Yeah.
maps happened,
Uh-huh.
everyone seemed to know where China was. Like, wow,
Uh-huh.
interest in China is growing. It's like, no, it's not that interest in China is growing. It's that
Hmm.
maps were made and people saw where China was on a map. It's like without the map, people didn't know. So without the internet, people also wouldn't know. So the overall interest in Burma is like still
Hmm.
the same. It just seems
Hmm.
like there's more interest in like Burmese
Hmm.
small arms, like with the
Right.
advent of the internet. But really, no, it's still the same as it's ever been. So I wonder. I often wonder if that's the case.
Yeah, and I mean, we also, it has to be said that we're talking about a terrible conflict that's been going on for going on 2.5 years now. And even when you go and talk to educated people that in the West that knew that a coup happened, they don't really even know the conflict is still going on, or they get the basic events confused of like, well, hasn't it always been a dictatorship, or yeah, what was Aung San Suu Kyi doing? It's just it just really speaks to that incredible lack of reporting and interest and engagement in Western countries, and talking about the standstill that they're in, that we've established in this conversation, and yet there are things to break out of that standstill, but it continues to be this victim of unengagement, of reductionist combined with exotified thinking. And so again, that's where we hope that conversations like this are able to pull some of those threads and to show a different view and vision than just the simple story that's been repeated from one decade to the next.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
We do what we can, right?
Mm-hmm. That's true. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thanks again for spending this time. It's been great to hear your background and your knowledge and experience and expertise of all these topics. It definitely gives me a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure of our listeners as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much for being interested in it, and then for on this really bygone odd topic when it comes to the whole field of Burma study anyways, but I really appreciate it. And it's an awesome thing to see what you're doing here with the podcast, and keep on trucking.
I'll be honest, not only is asking for donations my least favorite thing in the world to do, I find it pretty uncomfortable as well. Yet, it is an unavoidable but necessary task in order to ensure that our platform can continue to bring you stories from post-coup Myanmar. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that there is a basic minimum cost to keep our engine humming. So please allow me to take a moment for that least favorite and uncomfortable thing to do, and ask sincerely for your generosity in supporting our mission. If you found value in today's show and think others might as well, we ask that you take a moment to consider supporting our work. Thank you for taking the time to hear our spiel. And with that, it's off to work on the next episode. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.